one of the definitions is that a state that cannot go to war cannot be considered a normal state. Andrew Oros says that a state which does not have which is not an independent armed state cannot be a normal state. For the purposes of this paper, for the purposes of my research, the definition that I have used is that a state which does not have the ability to fulfill its regional and global responsibilities as per its stature, in Japan's case, a middle power, and does not have the necessary internal policies that facilitate the fulfillment of this role, cannot be considered a normal state. So Japan, because of the pacifist constitution, because of the self-imposed curbs, according to me, cannot fully fulfill its regional and global responsibilities as a middle power. So this is probably why Japan is not considered a normal state in international relations. However, it is widely believed now, after the Cold War, that Japan is well onto the path of normalization. Although I wouldn't say that Japan is fully normalized, but it's almost halfway there. Also, in my research, I do not consider normalization as, we don't have to consider normalization as overall normalization of Japan. You can see certain needles of normalization that are happening in Japan within individual policies, etc. So moving on to the crux of my paper, which is Japan's arms export policy. So why the arms export policy? Arms export and weapons trade is a normal tool of foreign policy and diplomacy for most states in the world. Japan, moreover, has very advanced technological and military capabilities. So the question does arise, why wouldn't Japan export its weapons? It prevents Japan from attaining the full potential of its alliance with the United States, which is one of the most important parts of Japan's foreign policy, the security umbrella of the United States. It prevents Japan from playing a major role in regional global politics affairs, as I just mentioned. So it's before understanding Japan's arms export policy, it's important to understand Japan's defense industry per se. So during the Cold War years, when the whole debate of introducing the Yoshida Doctrine with giving more importance to the economy and keeping the security dynamics at a lower level, when that debate was happening, there was also a debate with regard to autonomous defense production that was happening in Japan. So there was this huge lobby that was vouching for autonomous defense production, and that Japan should be completely self-reliant when it comes to its defense production. This was a way of ensuring that Japan does not fully become dependent on the United States, while also not so dependent that it would create the fear, that it would threaten the United States. So it was a way of hedging with the United States, having autonomous defense production. But because of the pacifist opposition within Japan, in order to introduce autonomous defense production, or kokusanka as it was called, the arms export was a clause that was sacrificed. So this is something that you will see on and off in Japanese security policy, the history of Japanese security policy, the evolution. It's called the reach, reconcile, reassure approach. You give one thing, you take something back. That's how you reassure the population. So to introduce autonomous defense production, to have a strong defense industry, arms export policy was sacrificed to a great extent. So this is a very important relationship that needs to be understood. So what is Japan's arms export policy? This started in the year There are basically three important milestones. First was in the year 1967, when something called the Three Principles of Arms Export was issued. Then in 1976, a comprehensive ban on arms export was issued. And then finally in 2014, as we all know, the ban on arms export was removed by Prime Minister Abe. So the three principles of 1967 that was introduced, which for the first time banned arms export. What was the immediate need for this? At this time, the Vietnam War was going on, and there was a lot of fear among the Japanese population that Japan would participate indirectly in the Vietnam War. The fear was so much that it's a very interesting instance that it was found that the Sony camera was used by defense by the missile guidance system of the United States in Vietnam, and this created a huge uproar in the Japanese population. So this was going on in the background, and the lower house elections were about to come. So all of this, and then there was the pressure. The Okinawa issue was going on, and the domestic population was extremely unhappy that US would retain Okinawa as a base. So because of all this, the prime minister at that time decided to issue a ban on arms export in the year 1967. So this ban was basically this was a spatial ban. It banned export to communist countries. It banned exports to countries that were involved in UNSC sanctions violation. It banned exports to countries that were involved in international conflict. So it was just a spatial ban, a geographical ban. It was not a list control. So this was just a spatial ban that was introduced in 1967. Then in 1976, a very comprehensive ban was introduced. This was not just a spatial ban. This was a complete ban on arms export. Although they didn't use the word ban, they used the word refrain, which led to a lot of loopholes later. But in 76, you see a more comprehensive ban. And then finally, in 2014, you see that this ban gets removed by Prime Minister Abe. So again, in 76, when the comprehensive ban was placed, this was because there was a lot of domestic uproar about the export of C-1 military aircrafts to Middle East and to China, and US-1 to China. So almost every time these policies are a way of reassuring the domestic population when there is an uproar about some kind of security provision. So even though I have examined all these bans in details, and I've seen if there were exceptions, if these bans were being violated, and you find a lot of exceptions that are being introduced. After 67, after 76, even after the comprehensive ban, there were 21 major exceptions that Japan has published after the 76 comprehensive ban, most of them to the United States. And Japan finds a way of justifying these exceptions. Another thing that I want to say is that none of these are all cabinet decisions or policy statements. None of them they don't have any statutory merit. They don't have any legal merit. Yes. So in 2014, the arms export ban was removed. This was a part of Prime Minister Abe's systemic change of Japan's security policy. Japan announced the policy of proactive contribution to peace in 2013 NSS. So Prime Minister Abe has very strong goals of revision of Japan's constitution, making Japan normal. So this has been a process that has been going on since the end of this Cold War, since the end of the Cold War. However, this is also about Japan playing a more active role in the global and regional affairs, which was very evident in what Japan called the proactive contribution to peace, which was introduced in its first national security strategy in 2013. Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Oh. So in my PhD, what I did was I examined whether Japan has, so within arms export policy, within each of these case studies, I examined whether Japan has attained normalization only in terms of the status of these policies, or also in terms of its behavior, and also in terms of its implementation. So I looked at the text of these policies very closely. And so as I said, so the change from 67 to 76 was more comprehensive. The ban was more comprehensive. However, the loophole was in the use of the word refrain from arms export, which Japan violated, which Japan utilized to a great extent. Secondly, it was also comprehensive because it also introduced, apart from the ban on export of weapons, it also introduced a ban on export of technology and equipments that could go into making weapons. So that's, in that way also, it was more comprehensive. When it comes to the final 2014 policy, wherein they removed the ban on arms export, there are three principles in this. In the first principle, the first principle talks about what are the cases in which the arms export will not be permitted. First, where it violates treaties and other international agreements that Japan is part of. Second, it violates the obligations of the UNSC resolutions. And third, if the destination is a country party to a conflict. But here, they add an addition, which is a country against which UNSC is taking measures. So in the previous policies, this part was not there, that it's a country against which UNSC is taking measures. So this completely rules out United States. It is involved in a lot of conflicts, but there are no UNSC actions being taken. So this actually makes it a lot easier for Japan when you introduce this segment. The second principle basically talks about what are the areas where you can where you're allowed to export. So in areas where it contributes to active peace contribution and international cooperation, very broad terms, Japan can interpret it very liberally. Where it contributes to Japan's security, again, very broad terms, you can interpret it very liberally. Where you can also, where you can export when it contributes to SDF activities. Principle 3 is all about the curbs Japan continues to impose on extra purpose use or third party transfers. So you still have to take prior consent from Japan if you want to export Japanese defense equipment that you've bought from Japan, if you want to export it to third party or if you want to use it for extra purpose use. So you have to take prior consent, which makes the process very complicated. So when I look at the new arms export policy, which basically removes the ban for all practical purposes, I find that the first principle sounds very similar to the three principles. The second and the third make it null and void because they specify the conditions under which the weapons can be exported, even if they violate the first principle. The conditions in the second and the third principle are very open-ended and can be applied to almost any situation, as I just mentioned. There is another clause, which is that in any cases that Japan has not dealt with, if it's a new kind of weapon that is to be exported, if it's a new country that you're dealing with, if it's a special case, the case will be handled by the National Security Council. Over and above the process that you would normally follow, it will also be examined by the National Security Council. And the interesting part is that after these three principles were published, this was basically a very initial outline of the three principles. After that, the National Security Council of Japan published a detailed guideline in which they actually introduced a lot of things. And they also claimed that the NSC can revise these broader guidelines every time it feels the need for. So the arms export policy can be open to infinite changes and infinite revisions, because the NSC can come up with broad implementation guidelines, which can actually introduce many new laws. In fact, a lot of Japanese scholars have argued that NSC introduces, in its implementation guidelines, it actually introduces new things to the arms export policy. Japan has a very complicated export control framework under which, so this is the classification of controlled goods under Japan, under controlled goods for export. And herein, if you see, the first category is called arms. And from 2nd to 16, so the first category is the only thing, which is called arms, is the only thing that comes under the arms export policy, or the three principles of arms export. Everything else is controlled under the three principles of arms export. Everything else is allowed for dual use. And if you look at the first category of arms, here arms are defined as anything that A is mentioned in this category. There's a detailed list of arms here. So anything that is mentioned in this category and anything which is used by the military and for combat purposes. So what is interesting is that if you can show one use of one civilian use, if you can show one civilian use, you can claim that it's not arms or weapons. So that's a big loophole in the Japanese arms export policy, which has been constantly exploited and utilized by Japanese defense industry, which is why Japan's dual use export is actually quite profound and exponential. And this is something that India should work with Japan, and I would get to that a little later. Sorry?
Shana, your slides are intermittently coming and going. Are you?
No, I was moving them.
Okay. Can't see the slides at the moment.
You can't see.
Yeah.
Ma'am, should I share them for you if you're unable to share them?
So I drew up a flowchart of how the process of export happens in Japan, of arms export happens in Japan. So any industry actor who wants to export first has to classify the items under this category that I showed before. You have to classify the weapons under this category. And if it comes under the arms, the category of arms, you apply to the METI, the Ministry of International Trade. Once you apply to the METI will examine whether it violates the three principles of arms export. If it violates the three principles of arms export, it is rejected for export. If it does not violate, it goes for licensing under a law called FEFTA, and it is granted or not granted license. And if it needs special consideration, it has to go to NSC, which again decides if it will be rejected. If not rejected, it goes back to METI. So this is a very complicated process. And in the flowchart, in fact, it looks simpler than it is actually. And this procedural delay, the structural delay in the export is another reason why the Japanese arms export industry or the arms export policy is suffering a lot. Similarly, even so the licensing process is extremely complicated. I will not get into the details of it too much. So like I mentioned, the dual use exports is something that Japan, dual use exports of weapon related equipment, technology, etc., is something that Japan has been very good at. And apart from the loophole that I mentioned before, it's also because the dual use export provision is controlled by something called the no condition, under which the exporter is expected to know that if the weapons could be misused by somebody, if it could be used for improper third-party transfer, and if the exporter does not know this, he's allowed to export. So most exporters in this case can claim that they did not know if the weapons could be misused or used for extra purpose use, etc. So once this ban on arms export was withdrawn in the year 2014, I tended to look at everything that happened from that moment. So basically, whether the behavior or the implementation of this policy has been normalized. The policy has been normalized to a great extent, but has the implementation or the behavior been normalized? So I analyzed the following cases. I will not get into too much details. These are basically all the cases that Japan has dealt with, at least the important ones. And even among these, most of them have not been successes. Most of these cases have not gone through. Some of the biggest successes of Japan is the sale of seeker gyroscopes for the PAC-2 missiles with the United States. Again, the sale of seeker-related technology information with the UK, etc. Then Japan managed to provide patrol vessels to Vietnam, to Philippines. So these were some of the successful cases. But apart from that, most of the negotiations have ended in failure. So I went into METI, I went into MOD, and whatever information I could find, I managed to compile this chart of all the cases of export that happened between 2016 to 2018, which was the latest data available. And after looking into it, I found that in all the 3 years, almost 90% of the exports Japan's arms export pertain to temporary export of equipment, return of purchased equipment, and provision of technical equipment related to the activities of SDF. Even among these, most of the exports were directed towards the United States. Secondly, the cases, I told you, some special cases are approved by the National Security Council, which are cases in which Japan has no precedent in the past, etc. These are very special cases. And even among these cases, the most prominent one is just the TC-90 aircraft to Philippines, which shows that Japan is not. So just if you look at the number of cases being dealt by NSC, which are very few, it shows that Japan is not dealing with cases that it has not had past precedent of, which means the new type of cases are very few. The two major deals of transferring the US-2 amphibious aircraft to India and the Soryu-class submarines to Australia did not take off. A deal with the UAE, which approached Japan for buying Japan's C-2 aircraft, also did not take off. A major development which came was And a very important development was that Japan entered the F-35 consortium, but Japan entered this as a status of a customer, and also this came before 2012. So we cannot credit the 2014 policy for this. So what are some of the challenges to Japan's arms export policy and implementation? Why this dismal state of affairs? Why this dismal state of export even after 3 years? Although 3 years, 4 years, 5 years is a very, very small time to look at this. I understand that. But Japan is a country with coveted military technology. So one would think that it should be more than this. So what are the reasons what are the challenges to Japan's arms export policy and implementation? According to me, and what my research showed, was that the biggest challenge was a pacifist mindset in the Japanese society, within the bureaucracy, even within the military to some extent, within the defense industry. So in Japan, there's a popular phrase called merchant of death. So I interviewed some of the industry actors. I introduced some of the SDF personnel for my research, and I found that most of them would use this term merchant of death, by which they would mean that if their industry was associated with arms export, it would be automatically branded as merchant of death. So what's interesting in Japan is that none of the industries which deal with defense manufacture deal exclusively with defense manufacture. Even the biggest companies which deal with defense manufacture, only 10% of their manufacture is related to defense manufacture. Like ma'am previously said, Mitsubishi, Kawasaki, these are the two big companies, and even the biggest one, only 10% is given to defense. So for them, it doesn't make sense that they start prioritizing arms export or arms production, and that would be bad business for their other products, which are more important for them. Secondly, countries seek defense cooperation and partnerships with equal partners, which is ensured by mechanisms like servicing agreements, joint research projects, military exercises, information sharing. And this is something that is curtailed by the other factors of Japan's pacifism, such as Article 9 and the other restrictions imposed on its security policy. So all of this makes it difficult for Japan to have greater defense cooperation with countries, which leads to arms trade, etc. Then there is a culture of using euphemisms for certain military technology in Japan, which is very interesting, because the SDF is very cautious because it does not want to come as overly aggressive, overly militarist. So the SDF uses, a very good example is when Japan signed the ACSA agreement with Australia. Japan did not use the word ammunitions. It did not want to use the word ammunitions. So Australia was, these kind of terminologies have to be very precise when it comes to agreements like this. So Australia sent back the draft, and there was a lot of renegotiation to include the term ammunition, and it was introduced only in 2016. The agreement was signed in 2010, but this was introduced only in 2016 after the ban on arms export was removed. Secondly, the METI, which is the Ministry of International Trade and Ministry of Defense, they still serve, this is the hangover of the Cold War years, of the pacifist mentality, they still serve more as regulators rather than as facilitators of export. So the motivation is always to prevent the export from happening. Secondly, there are structural challenges in the industry. So because Japanese defense industry's only customer has been the self-defense forces of Japan, so this makes the cost per equipment very high, which makes it very difficult for Japan to be competitive in the international market, and which is of course a catch-22 situation, because unless Japan starts selling in the international market, the prices won't reduce, and unless the prices reduce, Japan cannot sell to the international market. Thirdly, Japanese products are not updated enough, because Japan has been so isolated with its autonomous defense production. Something very important in today's defense industry is being very updated, participating in joint production of weapons, which keeps the technology updated, etc. And in Japan's case, the technology is not updated enough of most weapons. Late arrival in the export market, because of which Japanese sellers, the PR team, it does not know the game of arms trade. It's a very precise game. It's a very nuanced game, and Japanese exporters are very new to the game. So this is something that is believed to have to have played a great role in the failure of the Soryu submarine deal with Australia. They say the French pitched the idea. I mean, there were a lot of other reasons, but the French pitched the idea so much better than the Japanese, and Japan lost the deal. It has a complicated export policy. The structure, the classification procedure, everything is extremely complicated. As I mentioned, I can go into the details if somebody wants to know. Fine. Then there are continued restrictions in the export policy. So I talked about the latest arms export policy. Even within that, even though it's supposed to be a overturn of the ban, but even within that, there are continued restrictions. Only government to government sales are allowed. You cannot sell to private entities. There is even within the SDF, there is a tendency to not let go of certain technology. For example, with the Soryu submarine, there was a big fear among the SDF that the technology would find its hands into to the Chinese via the Australians. So the SDF was against selling the Soryu submarines to Australians. Then finally, third party, the provisions of third party consent, that is selling to third party consent, that is required by Japan, the extra purpose use provision that is required by Japan, all this. So these impose a lot of restrictions, which makes the process very complicated. Then another very interesting thing is that even when Japanese arms exporters or defense industry actors are talking or negotiating with potential buyers, the restrictions are so much that you cannot talk about the technology, any specifics of the technology, because it will be considered a transfer of technology which was banned. So you cannot properly pitch the idea, because you cannot tell any details of the technology while you're pitching. And people will not be interested if you cannot pitch properly. So this is something that is a major problem. The bureaucratic delays, I believe, has increased with the intervention of the National Security Council. The Japanese arms export practices are very out of sync with international standard practices. So the EU list of classifying weapons is considered the standard practice. The NATO list is considered the standard practice of classifying weapons, which is very important if you want to be a prominent actor in the international defense market. And Japan's list is still not properly in sync with this international standard practice. Japan's still in tier 1, which just means basic compliance, and Japan should aim for tier 2, which means complete compliance with the international standard practices. Finally, another reason for why, another challenge is most countries seek to withdraw from buying Japanese product is that they believe it's not combat tested. So what is the way forward for Japan? Japan should harmonize its numbering and arms list with the European standards, as I just mentioned. It should publish its dual-use export licensing practices, because, as I said, dual-use export is something that Japan has had a lot of success in. So if it publicizes the export licensing practices well, there will be even more interest, and this is something Japan can go forward in the present time while it gains more expertise in the international arms trade market. So Japan has well-established expertise in carbon fibers and optics, and it should aim to become an essential component supplier in the global value chain of weapons in these areas. Then Japan, so there's something called spin-off and spin-off when it comes to defense technology. Spin-off means converting from military to civilian use, and spin-on means converting from civilian to military use. And the world has moved from spin-off to spin-on, and Japan is already a master of spin-on. So this is again something that Japan should publicize better to the world. It could continue to focus on resale of retired equipment, etc., reforming retired equipment and selling it to other countries. This to some extent can reduce the criticism that comes from the internal politics, the domestic population, etc. and it should focus on selling licensed products to deal with some of the restrictions. Right now, Japan has a different policy for production of weapons and for production of weapons and for export and licensing of weapons. It has different policies for this. But in countries such as the US, there is one integrated policy. It's called the US ITAR, and Japan should aim to go for something like the US ITAR, wherein it integrates all the policies. A good positive change in this direction was ATLA. It was an agency, acquisition technology and logistics agency that Japan started in 2016, which basically integrates R&D and production and some details about licensing, etc. So this is a good start, but there is a lot more that needs to be done. It needs to take a lot of steps to reduce the procedural burden on exporters, more proactive in public relations, encouraging more international defense industry exhibitions, expositions, etc. I will not get into too much detail of India-Japan defense industry. I don't know how much time I have.
Yeah, you should look into India right now, I think.
Yeah. So there are several. We all know that India-Japan defense cooperation has intensified, strengthened to a great extent. And this is because of a combination of several factors. One, that the rise of China, of course, the most important factor. Secondly, the fact that the whole rhetoric of Indo-Pacific, the Quad, all of these have brought India and Japan together. Then also because Japan wants to project itself as a more important global and international actor. This is what we saw with the proactive contribution of peace, and India was identified as one of its core integral partners for this process. So in 2000, so these are some of the significant milestones that India-Japan achieved. One of a very important year was 2015, when India and Japan, their status went into a special strategic and global partnership. India-Japan signed two very important agreements in this year. One was security measures for the protection of classified military information. Then the transfer of defense equipment and technology agreement. So Japan needs to sign the transfer of defense equipment and technology agreement with each country to start exporting to these countries, among other things. So Japan has signed that with India. In 2016, India-Japan signed the agreement for cooperation and peaceful use of nuclear energy. India-Japan completed the triad of inter-services exercise between India and Japan in the year 2018. We have JIMEX, we have Shinyu Maitri and Dharma Guardian. In 2019, we introduced the 2+2 foreign ministerial, defense ministerial level talks. And in 2020, India and Japan signed the acquisition and cross-servicing agreement. And this is important because India is the first non-Western country with which Japan has signed the ACSA agreement. So despite the 2015 defense equipment and technology transfer agreement that India and Japan signed, at least the arms trade between the country has been very slow, or the cooperation along these lines has been very low. And the very famous, the very publicized case of the US-2 amphibious aircraft, we all know about this. India wanted to secure 12 US-2 amphibious aircrafts from Japan. And Japan was offering it at, I think, 130 million per aircraft. And Japan found the quantity of the quantity demanded to be very low, 12. And because India was also demanding a joint production facility in India, and Japan found that the quantity of 12 aircrafts was too low to introduce a joint production facility in India. However, after a lot of negotiations, Japan did agree to almost 30% of production to happen in India. But despite this, the deal did not go forth. It's believed that India is negotiating with Russia on another aircraft. the range of which is not as good as the range of the Japanese US 2 amphibious aircraft. The range of the US 2 amphibious aircraft is 4,500 kilometers, but the range of the Russian aircraft is about 3,700 kilometers. The Russian aircraft has other advantages, but the Japanese aircraft is considered to be way more advanced, but the price is too high. And I explained the reasons for why the price is too high and all the other restrictions. So for all of these reasons, this deal did not go through, and this would have been one of the biggest deals for Japan after lifting the curb on arms export. So what are some of the other challenges between better India-Japan cooperation? Japan, so if you read some of the Japanese literature on this, on India-Japan security cooperation, etc., which is written in Japanese, you will find that there is a major concern of the security of technology. Like I said, SDF, the self-defense forces, there is a lobby within the SDF which is very protective of its technology, and which believes that India is not safe enough for the export of for the security of technology, for Japanese technology, which is not very conducive to the export of weapons. Secondly, cost. Like I said, even though some of the alternatives available to India and to other countries in the world may not be as good as Japanese technology. However, because of the cost, most countries are willing to take the chances, and the cost is very high of Japanese products. Secondly, under the new arms export policy, there is only government-to-government transfer, which is a problem. India and Japan have established a joint committee to determine transfer of weapons and equipment. And within this joint committee, from the Japanese side, there are representatives from MOFA. There are different MOFA is the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. There are representatives from METI, Ministry of Economy and International Trade. There are representatives from Ministry of Defense. And there is a major problem of bureaucratic delay in Japan. And METI and MOFA, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, is a ministry which is very strongly against Japan having a more active security policy, and MOD, on the other hand, encourages a more active policy. So there is always a friction between these two, and having these members in the joint committee could create problems of its own. Then, of course, there are structural problems in India's defense acquisition program. There are bureaucratic delays, there's corruption, there is a lack of defined structure, there's a lack of single accountability, so on and so forth. So these are the challenges that continue to affect the India-Japan equipment and tech transfer and defense cooperation. So this is where I stop. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Shana. Sorry. Yeah, thank you, Shana. Detailed statements that you've made. I'm sure there are lots of questions that should be raised, because you have brought onto the table a larger canvas of approach that Japan has taken towards, arms export. And of course, you've brought in also normalization program of Japan and how it has worked through its days. Let me see. People in the audience are requested to either raise hands or even you can use the chat box to send the questions across. Vishnu Prakash has raised hands. Admiral Vishnu Prakash or
Ambassador Vishnu Prakash, thank you very much. Yeah. Thank you very much. Shahana, compliments for a wonderful perspective that you have given. I'm most impressed that you use the C word only once, and that too not in the context of Japan, China, US. Now, as I see it, and correct me if I'm wrong, one of the reasons for the quest for normalization is the threat perception from China, and that is increasing by the day. Now, normalization, so-called normalization, is something that China is quite rattled about, or at least they oppose it publicly. And normalization is also happening at the behest of the US. So is there a concern in Japan that the US is a non-resident power, is here today, may not be there tomorrow, but China is very much around? So is that the China factor a mixed bag for Japan in the sense that they are concerned with the Chinese threat and also with the fact that the US may not play the role that's required at the right time. Lastly, the popular pacifist perception or the pacifist uh, popular pacifist perception is, you said it's changing. When do you see the Article 9 being amended? Do you think it can happen in a decade, more or less? I would appreciate your thoughts on it.
Thank you so much, sir. Absolutely, there is absolutely no doubt that China is one of the biggest factors for Japan's normalization. And combined with that is this dual hedging approach that Japan has dealt with throughout the Cold War period and post-Cold War, which is balancing the fear of entrapment within the US conflicts and the fear of abandonment by the US. So Japan has always played a balancing act. And there are many experts who would say that all of Japan's security policy, all of Japan's foreign policy is at the end of the day determined by its alliance relationship with the United States. And after the end of the Cold War, because of the fact that Soviet Union stopped becoming a threat, so there was this intense worry within Japan that without a Soviet threat, Japan might not serve the need that it served for the United States. So the fear of abandonment increased more than the fear of entrapment. So that was the beginning of the process of normalization. However, it has been majorly intensified by the Chinese threat, by a fear of Taiwan contingency, North Korea. All of these things together play a part, definitely. As far as the question of Article 9 is considered, so in 2015, Prime Minister Abe introduced something called the Peace and Security Legislation. And this was a revision. This was not a revision of Article 9, but it was a reinterpretation. And several reinterpretations have happened in the past. So I think, and the process of revision is a very complicated, the procedure is extremely complicated. There has to be a referendum. Both the houses have to come up with a 2/3 majority and so on and so forth. So even if the referendum, even if you get the 2/3 majority, I'm not sure if the referendum is something that could come through, or of course you go ahead and change the process of revising the constitution. That was also something Prime Minister Abe was looking at. So I think in the near future, what would happen is more revisions, more reinterpretations of the constitution. And I personally don't think that Japanese society is anywhere near ready for a complete revision of Article 9. And I think most of the purposes, and it has been successfully achieved by Japan to a great extent through reinterpretation of the constitution several times, and also using other loopholes. For example, sometimes if Japan wants to introduce an exception to one of its policies, it quotes the preamble of the constitution, where it adheres to contribute to international cooperation and peace. And it says that because Japan has to contribute to that as per the preamble, so this is not a violation of the pacifist clause of the constitution. So yes. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Much appreciated.
Thank you, sir.
We have two questions in the chat box, one by Captain Kiran Kankoje. Shana, you can have a look at it while I'll ask him if he can unmute himself and ask the question.
Ma'am, I cannot see the chat box. Oh.
Okay. It says, so effectively arms deal with India is a dead issue, even under the current administration?
No, of course, no, I don't think so. I mean, Japan is just starting with its arms export policy, liberal arms export policy, and India being the second biggest importer of arms export in the world. And now with the increasing strengthening of the relationship, I think the possibilities are only going to increase. And we have, but I think India should focus right now, when Japan's expertise is not built completely. I think India should focus on equipment transfer, technology transfer from Japan, rather than buying like bigger fully assembled products, etc. So I think Japan will have more success in doing those kind of things. Yes, yeah.
We have a question from Pavan Raghavendra. Pavan, would you like to ask the question? Okay, he says that how has the increasing importance of the Indo-Pacific region and the emergence of Quad as a major forum for security cooperation affected Japan's path towards normalization and arms export policy?
Well, there is no way for me to isolate the variables to say that which are the exact reasons that are leading to Japan withdrawing the bans on arms export, or giving up the 1% limit on military spending, or introducing the collective defense provisions. I think it's safe to say, and international relations is a complicated subject. It's not as simplistic as saying that one of these factors has led to it. It's always a combination of complex domestic factors, regional factors, the fact that Korea, China are threats in the region, the fact that there is a fear of US abandonment, the fact that Japan wants to to project itself as an important global and international actor. And we must remember that Japan is a country that is feared in history. Is a country that many countries feel suspicious of in history with its complicated past during the Second World War. So and it's not surprising to Japan to once again be more ambitious. There is still a lot of fear of Japan militarizing, but of course that's a stretch. But so yeah, all of these factors, Japan's ambitions included, all of these factors together definitely together has affected this process of normalization. And normalization is not a one-time thing. It's a very slow process. It is spread across different facets, different arenas, and it will be a slow process. Newer factors could speed it up further, perhaps in the future. But yeah, that's my answer.
You have a very interesting question from Ambassador Venkatraman. He says, given that both Japan and India have their own issues in selling and acquisition, what is the way ahead? One, are there any areas which can meet common requirements, such as matching India's multi-role transport aircraft programs with Japan's C2 program, and some key technologies for India's submarine program, such as lithium-ion batteries?
So I think something good that is happening is the fact that India and Japan have started holding these regular defense industry business forums. It is happening annually, where Japanese defense industry experts come to India or go to Japan, and they hold these expositions and exhibitions. And I think what Japanese need is more of these kind of international more exposure. And with India, this is already happening. The Joint Working Committee on Defense is a good idea, it's a smaller, more concise committee. I think the ambassadors here would know better about this, and this could help to micromanage the problems that both industries face, both India and Japan, and that is a step in the right direction. Thirdly, I am not qualified to answer the question about the submarine technology that India can borrow from Japan, sir. So I would have to let go of that. Yes.
Yeah, I'm surely it's in lens where we will really don't find it difficult to go forward. We have a raised hand by, I think, Ambassador Kanishkvich.
Am I audible?
Oh, okay. Hello. Sorry. You all are, offline, so I couldn't realize. Yeah, Kanish, go ahead.
Am I audible? Sorry.
Yes, yes.
Yeah, you are.
Oh, thank you. So as pointed out earlier, the MOSA and the MOD in Japan, they have their own frictions regarding how they look at normalization is coming up. So considering the fact that we, as India, is engaging in 2+2 dialogue, and we also have another multilateral that come up, would that friction become a hindrance or slow things out in any kind of talk India or the other nations that the US and Australia would be doing with Japan?
It's not very clear what he's saying. Your
Ganesh,
voice
I
is-
could you please type in the thing by the time I will attend to Vice Admiral Muralidharan's questions? Thank you. Sir, could you please go ahead?
Yeah, thank you, Shana. That is very well covered. Just, one or two observations. One is that, we must realize that while they were being withdrawn, Japan, they had the cover and protection of the United States. As far as they called it self-defense forces. I must also add that while we called it the self-defense forces, at least in the maritime field that I'm aware of, their equipment and systems were as good as anybody else that they could offer. So their ships could do it. And we have been having, our maritime forces have been exercising with them for many years. We had very close interaction with them, both the Indian Navy as well as the Indian Coast Guard, and we've had. Now, some of the things on offer which they had, which they were willing to offer, were not, if I say, may not be something what we wanted. So maybe the defense procurement, etc., will take time. I don't want to comment on that now. But like when they started coming out for the anti-piracy patrols, that is when they actually came out of their cocoon and started coming into the thing. Now with Quad and others, I'm sure they will get closer and closer. And with, as you very rightly brought out, after Prime Minister Shinzo Abe came and brought up that cooperation and friendship, etc., that is where we are getting closer. So I think we are going to see the development of, our cooperation further in the years ahead than what has happened now. Yes. So this is an issue, but I think you've covered most of the issues very well. So mine is more of an observation than.
Yes, sir. Sir, I completely agree that Japan was always, even though it did not have full naval or air force or armies, but it had a self-defense forces, but it was always under the US security umbrella. And that's completely true. But like I said, there's always this inherent fear of abandonment by the United States. And also United States has always been unhappy about the support that Japan can provide to the United States in case of a conflict. So until recently, Japan could only provide logistical support to the United States or rear area support to the United States. And this changed in 2014 when 2015, when for the first time Japan has openly come out saying that it will support not only the US, but its other allies in case of a regional conflict and move away from logistical support to combat support, and also not just rear area support. So Japan is giving more to the US. It's a give and take situation to ensure that the US stays in the picture. So what you pointed out is, yes, absolutely correct. Yes, sir. Thank you.
Yeah, I think you're getting a lot more inputs which you can put back into your work, Shana. There's a question that Kanishk was asking you, which was, as pointed out, the MOFA and MOD have some amount of friction between them in terms of their outlook on normalization. Would that be a hindrance or slow things out for Indo-Japanese defense acquisition? And on a larger scale, how would that affect Japan's approach or stance in the Quad? Let me take one more question, which is pretty related to this by Captain Kiran Kankoje. That is, how would Quad standing interaction help accelerate tech transfers under dual use items? So you have.
Ma'am, could you repeat that, please? Sorry, the second question.
Quad standing interaction, how will it help the dual use of tech transfer items? Okay. So, okay.
Yes. So answering Kanishk's question, there is a lot of bureaucratic rivalry within Japan, within the ministries of Japan. And this has been a problem which not only affects its security policy, but it affects all levels of governance in Japan. And this was a very big effort in this direction to positively resolve this was made by Prime Minister Abe when he brought about the National Security Council. So it was a structural change, and the National Security Council would sit above all the ministries. It would have a small executive committee of 4 ministers, 9 ministers, and a larger committee. So it's like almost like a tiny kitchen cabinet. So where the 4 ministers would take quicker decisions to overpower the bureaucratic infighting and the delays that happen with different ministries. But Japan is also a country that very interestingly loves to hold on to its rules, its rituals, its past procedures. So the more deeper I look into National Security Council, I find that it is still, to a great extent, still fighting with these bureaucratic infighting, even among the National Security Council, but it has been resolved to a great extent, which has allowed for faster decision making in many areas. For example, when Japan gave a round of 10,000 round of ammunitions to South Korea while it was in a UN, deployed in a UN mission, while it was in active combat. Something very new for Japan to do. It was a lightning decision made by the National Security Council. Similarly, Japan had peacekeeping operations in South Sudan. It was actually the last active peacekeeping deployment of Japan in the UN operation in South Sudan. And both sending the forces there and withdrawing them when the violence escalated in South Sudan, all of these were decisions made by National Security Council at a speed not seen before in Japan. So a lot is credited to the National Security Council for the increase in the speed of decision making, etc. And well, I think it would affect the Quad, any of the processes under the Quad mechanism or in the larger ambience of Indo-Pacific. The bureaucratic delays might affect it as much as it affects anything else. And yeah, I hope I've answered your question. And the
Quad, and does it help in dual use and tech transfer?
Yeah, so dual use is something that has never been restricted in Japan. So there are categories of controlled goods which are completely open for dual use export, and then there are categories which you can if categories of arms, and if you can find a civilian use for it, you can export that also under the dual use mechanism. So dual use export is not something that has been restricted in Japan, and Japan has used it to its fullest potential. And this is not something that would be restricted or progressively or positively affected because of the Quad or the Indo-Pacific, etc. Yeah, thank you.
Kanishk, you have one other question he's put across to you, Shana, that is currently with the new Prime Minister in the Kantai. Can we see a difference, the current Kishida's government's approach, I suppose, from that of earlier Abe Suga's government? Do you see any difference with respect to how he would be tackling the security concerns?
Well, as I think ma'am dealt with it in the beginning a little bit when she said he's considered to be center-left, not much of a security hawk, etc. However, it's still the LDP, and within LDP, you don't see, Abe was, of course, a big change, but apart from Abe, you don't see among Japanese prime ministers, you don't see very revolutionary personality changes. Most of them will toe the different faction lines. Most of them will toe the party line. And in fact, Kishida was responsible he was the foreign minister when India was, when we were negotiating the strategic and global partnership with Japan in 2015. So, and he's said to have played a very important role in that. And also in Japan, I think the priorities right now are more domestic policy. So I don't see major or new foreign policy, security policy decisions being made anytime in the near future. I think the focus will be more on domestic issues for the near future. Yeah, thank you.
Let me, ask you a thing so that it sort of builds into the discussion that we're having today. The current Taiwan issue that has happened, it's a boiling issue for us in the region. Given that, how do you think Kishida is going to react to it? Because Abe currently has become much more strongly putting up his views by saying democracy and democratic rights. But then Abe does not really figure in the picture right now because it's Kishida in the hands of affair. How do you picture this whole issue of Taiwan, and where do you think Japan will position itself? And it's critical for Japan, as we all know, because of the sea routes and other factors of territorial concerns. So if you could get into that a little.
Thank you, ma'am, for the question. I am not aware of any statement by him on Taiwan yet. I'm not aware of it yet. However, Suga made a very clear statement on Taiwan. He said that in case of a Taiwan contingency, Japan will intervene in favor of Taiwan. Suga did say that. And honestly, I do not know how Kishida will deal with it, but I would say it would depend to a great extent on the pressures from the United States, or the stance that the United States would take on that. I mean, that's my opinion, but maybe you can tell us more about it.
Let's not get it into a classroom situation. Shana, you're way past that. Any more questions for Shana? Or anyone who would like to make any observations about her work or directions of her future work? Shruti, should we? We have. Yes, Ambassador, please go ahead.
No, I just wanted to thank you very much, Chair. I just wanted to make a very brief observation. I've served in Japan, and the Japanese bureaucracy is quite strong. Traditionally, both MITI as well as Gaimasho, they are quite strong. And the tug of war between ministries is a very, very common thing. I mean, other than India, I mean, where everything is hunky-dory, quote unquote, other places, there is always tug of war that goes on. So, and in Japan, generally politicians have not deferred to, or at least had to take a cue to a large extent from the bureaucracy. And Shinzo Abe had tried to assert to an extent he could do that effectively. So that is the state of affairs in Japan. I just wanted to add my penny's worth on that. Thank you.
Thank you. You would know more about the workings of government at a more deeper level than any of us can ever dream to. So this is very valuable.
Thank you.
Excuse me.
Yeah.
Actually, thank you so much for this wonderful presentation. Many of the new things about China and about Japan came into light, and actually we are having keen interest in observing international relations, particularly China, Japan, Vietnam. So my question is, since India and Japan has a very robust relation, and it's going to celebrate 70 years of anniversary next year. Yeah. In the meantime, China has a very disturbing relationship, means quote unquote, with most of its neighboring countries. So how can India cultivate this situation into its favor?
Well, with respect to Japan, I think India is very actively cultivating this in its favor. We have strengthened our defense cooperation. We have a complete triad of armed forces exercises with Japan. We have ministerial 2+2 ministerial level interaction. We have annual summits. So I think India is like, there is also this commonality between both India and Japan, is that both India and Japan do not enjoy the luxury of distance from China. So both understand very well the fears of treading the waters with China very carefully. There's a strong economic interdependence for both India, for both Japan. Of course, the difference for Japan is that Japan is a US ally and comes under the US security umbrella. And that's not something India has, or India is even willing to do. So there are all of these factors, and Quad, IndoPacific, under all these umbrellas, right? India and Japan are coming together. And I think, especially after 2014, we have seen, I would say, a big change in India's foreign policy approach, with the Act East approach, engaging ASEAN, engaging East Asian countries more, and doing all of these. China is, of course, in the elephant in the room, the prime motivating factor to some extent. So So I think, yes, India is doing a lot and we need to do more. We still have our Cold War hangover of strategic ambiguity, uh, mm, uh, in the background shadowing over us, and India needs to fully get rid of that. But of course, we are moving in the right direction. Yes. Thank you.
Kanishk is pretty excited with your subject. He's given the third question, which says, as Japan moves ahead to normalize and build itself in terms of defense and its stature in the Indo-Pacific, how would the introduction of AUKUS change and impact things?
Well, I don't think that AUKUS should be seen as an alternative to the Quad, or it is in no way something that would threaten the Quad. It is something that would only strengthen the Quad. It should be seen as supplementary to the Quad. And I think AUKUS would serve the military element, or more of a security defense element. It would bring to the whole Indo-Pacific narrative that which is something that Quad is unable to bring for various reasons. And I do not think that India-Japan relations will in any way be affected by AUKUS. Of course, it's interesting that how history repeats itself, because Japan was competing with the Australians for the submarines, and it went to the French, and then the same deal later went to the Australians. So it also shows that
to US. US, the AUKUS is US.
Sorry, the US. Yeah, yes. And so it shows that nothing is permanent in the realm of arms export. There are no permanent friends, no permanent enemies. So yes, that's my answer. Thank you.
Thank you, Shana. Are we looking for more questions? If you would like to ask. I don't see any raised hands, Shana. If you would like to make some closing remarks about your talk.
Thank you, ma'am. I'm very grateful to ICS for giving me this opportunity to present my research. And I hope I've made some valuable inputs. And if you have any other feedback, please email to me, or please we can continue the discussion elsewhere. Thank you once again to the wonderful audience and for all the questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Shana. It's nice to see a student grow in stature, not only in professionally to become an assistant professor in University of Nevada, but also to be able to defend her work. Thank you, audience, for your patience in listening in and also asking such valuable questions which would enhance her work. This being the last time seminar, and I have happened to be the chair out here, I'll take a personal thing to thank ICS for having, religiously giving us various platforms on which we've been interacting and pushing forward our agenda of understanding Japan from Indian point of view. I would also like to take this opportunity to wish all of you a very good vacation as well as a very happy new year, hoping that this 2022 will give us opportunities to come back and do offline engagements also. Could I therefore ask, I think Shruti, you would be taking over from here, or is it Ambassador Kanta?
Yes, thank you. Thank you everyone for joining in today. And we hope to see you all at the seminar next year, at the Wednesday